do it again.
Start again?
Yep.
I'm Henry Butler, and I was born on August 9th, 1921, in Würzburg, Germany. And the city was largely Catholic, and schools were based on religion. Protestants to their school, Catholics to their schools, and Jews to their own school. And out of a population of 100,000, there were approximately 2,500 Jewish people. The congregation was only one congregation, and it was Orthodox, maybe considered neo-Orthodox, but it was definitely Orthodox. And so I went to the Jewish school for the first 4 years of my education, and boys, girls together. And every day after the period of where we had something to eat, we would say the Birkat Hamazon, and we read all the prayers, of course. And so my background was very much Jewishly oriented from that time on. Also, my grandparents on my father's side had a kosher house, and I would stay with them on Friday nights, I would assume from age 3 or 4, maybe 5, and then would walk with my grandfather to the synagogue. And as a matter of fact, they lived in the same house as the rabbi of the congregation. He lived on the first floor, they lived on the third floor. And at the synagogue, I would also meet my other grandfather and my cousin. And after services, we would guide to a konditorei, patisserie. And after that, apparently we were able to still have lunch because we went to their house for lunch. And let's see what else on this particular situation.
What was your name at birth?
Well, my name at birth was Hans Buchsbaum, and that changed when I was in the army just before going overseas. I wanted to change Hans to Henry, and that's the only change I had planned. And the judge advocate said, I think you should change your whole name. And I hadn't given that any thought. And I said, but let me look at a telephone book. And I looked under BU, and I came to Butler, because that was the mayor of New York, was, what was his name now? I always anyhow, his name was Butler. So I took that name, and after the army service ended, it was quite complicated to make the change again, and I remained Henry Butler for the rest of my life. I sometimes regretted it because I didn't think that Butler reflected really my background or anything like that, but got married under that name, and so it stayed. Mistake.
Mayor name.
Yeah.
Well, you can correct that now.
Yeah.
Okay.
What was the name?
Nicholas Butler.
No. First names?
Murray Nicholas.
Yeah, Nicholas Butler. He was not the mayor, but he was the president of Columbia University. And so his name I took.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead, say that again.
Say it again?
You can tell that story again.
Oh, well, in the army, before going overseas, I wanted to change my first name from Hans to Henry because I didn't want to get mixed up with the German soldiers whom we might capture. And so, because I was in army intelligence, and we were interrogating German prisoners. So, but the judge advocate said I should change my whole name, and I hadn't given any thought to that. And so I asked for a phone book, and I went to BU, Buchsbaum. I wanted to keep BU. And I came to Butler, and Nicholas Maury Butler was the president of Columbia University, so that name was familiar to me. And I became that and remained that for the rest of my life until this day. And I had considered briefly to change it when I came out of the Army, but everything had been changed legally, and there was just too much of a problem to make the change back.
Henry, why don't you talk about growing up Jewish in Germany? Tell about that.
Well, as I said before, I went to a Jewish public school, and we, of course, studied Hebrew every day, and otherwise we had a regular curriculum. And we, on Saturday mornings, which I explained before, I went to services regularly with my grandfather, and then after services went with my other grandfather and my cousin to Konditorei, and then afterwards for lunch to their house. And after the 4 years at the Jewish school, went to the gymnasium, which is an in-between, something like a high school, but it's a little bit more advanced. And there we had school on Saturday morning, but I would not write on Saturday morning. I didn't take any notes. And in the afternoon, we had a Jewish youth organization, and I was leading a group of younger ones in the afternoon, and in the evening, we, the older ones, had another session together. So we kept pretty active that way. We also went on trips on Sundays together, and once we encountered a group of the Hitler Youth, and there was a little bit of antagonism, but nothing physical, just catcalls.
Can you describe that a little more, that encounter?
That encounter, I mean, that was not a significant encounter, but on the way to the Jewish school, we always passed a house where some kids always had catcalls for us, but nothing physically happened there.
What did they say?
Pardon me?
What did they yell?
And I really can't remember the words that they used. It's a long time ago, I don't know. But, and in gymnasium, I didn't have any problem. In fact, one fellow, even in his Hitler Youth uniform, would bicycle with me and didn't think about anything. And at one time, one of them made some nasty remark, and I was fairly strong, and I put him down in the sandbox. So that was the end of that. So I had no serious problems there. And I went to that school until 1936. Of course, Hitler came to power in 1933. One of the professors became the mayor of Würzburg. Another became the Gauleiter of the area. Gauleiter, like meaning probably a county, maybe. County, something like that. Not state, county. And so...
was that a new Nazi position?
Yeah, oh yeah, they were Nazi, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Although some of my other professors were strongly Catholic and more the Bayerische Volkspartei, which was the Catholic party in Bavaria.
Was there much anti-Semitism in Würzburg or Bavaria?
Well, it obviously became more and more, and that induced us in 1937 to move to Frankfurt. And where my mother had a twin sister and family, they had moved to Frankfurt in 1936 together with my mother's mother, and so we followed in 1937, and we stayed there for just 1 year. And because I left in May of '38 for the United States. My father had, no, my mistake. I left in June 16th for the United States. My father had gone on a business trip to England in May of '38, as he had done many times before. And after he had left, the police called. They wanted to talk to him when he came back. And so we told him not to come back. And he never came back. But he met me on the ship in Southampton. And my mother had taken me to the boat in Cuxhaven near Hamburg, where they have a America Line steamer left, SS New York. And that's another little story there. We had bought, my parents had bought a Leica camera because that was easily converted into funds in the United States. But when I came to the boat, they said that there's a new law that you had to pay the equal amount in some form of a fee. And well, at that point, it was too late to do anything about it. And so they confiscated the camera, and all I had was my 46 German marks, which was roughly $10, with which I arrived in the United States.
Let's go back a little bit to the before you left. And you mentioned, I asked you about anti-Semitism, and you said it got more and more, and then we left for Frankfurt. Can you describe what you mean by more and
you
more?
know, I don't remember the degree, but there were a number of issues, of course. First of all, my father's business had to do with the farmers. It was a business for agricultural machines. And the farmers during the Depression wouldn't pay. So that became a very difficult situation. And as a Jew, it was almost impossible to pursue them, to get any money from them. So my father's business switched into something entirely different. And it was a machine that was used in the textile industry. And in fact, the people who did that were also Jewish, and they lived in Düsseldorf, as I remember, and they moved. One partner was Jewish, the other was not. The Jewish partner moved to Manchester. In fact, my parents eventually ended up in Manchester as well. And they were in Manchester until 1943. When I was already in the army, they came to the United States. So
So your father had to sell his business?
well, it was not so much of a selling, it's just,
So let's start with that. My
just
father had to
when kaput.
start telling that story. My father.
Yeah. Oh, well, my father's business was together with my grandfather. My grandfather, Buxbaum, died in December 29, and so my father was left with the rest of it, but it just petered out as far as I know. I mean, I was too young to really know all the details, but I know it was not functioning. Yeah.
So there was a war, Aryanization, ARISERT.
Oh, AST. Oh, I was here. Oh, well.
Arisiert.
Oh,
All right, so let me know when you're ready for that.
that was.
Hold on, we're not recording yet. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, well, I worked when I went out of when I had to leave the gymnasium. You had to work, and also had to go still to school in the afternoon. But I worked for the Rice and Company, which was a cousin of my father's, and quite a few of my Jewish friends were employed there. But the company had to be taken over by a non-Jew. I guess that was in '37 maybe, and it was called, the company was arisiert. An Aryan, in other words, had to take over. And so that ended for us. And that was another reason why we moved to Frankfurt, to follow the family that had moved there.
And why did you leave gymnasium?
Well, they left the gymnasium because it became pretty unpleasant with all the marches and everything that occurred. Well, I forgot to say earlier that every Friday night in Würzburg they used to, before Hitler came to power already, they marched along and they sang when das Judenblut vom Messer spritzt, when the Jewish blood flows from the knife. It was one of the songs. I can't remember all the words, but so it became rather unpleasant, the whole atmosphere, and so that was one more reason why we had to leave, why we decided to leave. Yeah.
Tell me more about your parents. What were their names?
Well, my mother was a twin, had a twin sister, and she was the older one by half an hour or so. And my grandparents on the maternal side, their name was Loebmann, Loebmann, and they were in the business together with my uncle and with my mother's uncle, and that was dealing in what is it called? I'm trying to think of the name here. Can think. Do I have a translation there by any chance?
Don't have it, sorry.
Don't have it? Okay. Well, anyhow, the paper and let's just put it at paper and other paper and metal, paper and metals. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Sternberg in Seattle had a similar business. Are you familiar with the? No? Okay. Yeah, that's very, very similar. Anyhow, so my
Your father, what was your mother's name again?
my mother's name was Loebmann.
Lubin. First name?
Oh, my mother, Lily, and my father's name was Herman, Herman, double N. We changed. He dropped off one N later in the United States. And I mean, do you want to know anything about else about
Sure,
my parents?
Know about your parents, yeah.
Well, my father had been, of course, in the German army and in World War One, and he was in the medical corps, and but he also had gone to England a number of times prior to that, and he spoke fluent English. And in fact, he came back from England to join the army because he was called back. He was in the reserve, he was called back, and he did come back. But he, I think that covers about.
Would you say your family was Zionists?
Well, I wouldn't call it Zionist because I remember that I was on the streets of Würzburg with a blue box collecting money for the Karen Kayemet Fund. But we were very strongly Jewish and regularly attended services. And I mentioned before that you had to have a high hat to be called to the have an aliyah, and everybody had his high hat lined up in a particular room at the synagogue. So when you went there, you put that on. And but the
Would you say you were a very assimilated family?
no, I wouldn't say that. No, my parents belonged to all the Jewish organizations in town, and I don't recall that they belonged to any non-Jewish ones. Yeah, there was the casino, was the club. There were numerous ones, but they were all Jewish. I don't think there was much integration. Yeah.
Do you recall when the Nazis took power in 1933? And
Well, I
what are your
remember.
memories of that?
I remember that certainly, and of course, at first, Frontsoldaten were excused from some of the restrictions that were imposed, but
What do you mean by that?
people who had been at the front in the army were exempted for some of the laws that were immediately propagated and so on. Became the. I'm trying to think. Let's see. Let me think for a minute. So, well, at first, of course, the communists were arrested, then the Social Democrats, and the Jews came not soon, pretty soon after. And I recall that the father of one of my close friends on November 9th, well, not November 9th, because I wasn't there anymore. When Hitler came to power, apparently they arrested some people, and when they came to get him, he jumped out of the window of the third floor and committed suicide. And also, a nephew of my uncle, on his way to Dachau, jumped out on the train and also killed himself. So those are things I remember from early on. And
Were you afraid as a child?
Uncomfortable at times. Yeah, I mean, when you saw all the Hitler youth marching and so on, yeah. But I said never had any physical encounter that was for any problem. No. And
And you were involved in Jewish clubs and organizations?
yeah, that's what I mentioned earlier. Yeah, Jugendbund. Yeah, yeah.
And I read that you were quite an athlete.
Yes, I was. Well, since we were excluded from everything else, there was a Jewish sport club, and we did have competition, and I didn't run quite as fast as Jesse Owen, but 13 some seconds or so for 100 meters was not bad. And I did the broad jump and high jump and discus, all those different things. So I was pretty active, and I also, of course, went swimming in summer because we didn't have an indoor pool. Although actually there was one, I think, but we never went there. Don't know whether we could have. Yeah. And we lived in first in when I was born, there was a very much of a shortage of housing after the war, similar to what was experienced in Seattle when they became here after World War II. And so the first one was a very small apartment, from what I recall, and then we moved to another one, Texterstraße, and then we moved to Schillerstrasse eventually. And when I had my bar mitzvah, we were there. Oh, I forgot to talk about a very important aspect, my bar mitzvah. And I was a Levi, and Shabbat Nachmu was my assigned one, and I chanted the 35 verses, and apparently with a pretty good, strong voice. But afterwards, I lost my voice completely. For 3 weeks, I had to get some injections to be able to talk at all. But so that was an important thing. Bar mitzvahs was very important, but the parties were quite small in comparison to what is taking place here. Yeah, I probably invited 10 or 12 young boys, and that was the party. Yeah. But I got some nice presents, and I had a list that I had until recently. I think 46 or 47 presents I got. And one of them was a bicycle. And of course, the bicycle was very important as transportation that we used all the time. Except on Saturday. I would not use it on Saturday.
Great. Those are great stories. Now let's talk about when your family started talking about leaving Germany. When did you think?
Well, in 1936, I spent 6 weeks in London together with my cousin. My mother had 2 uncles in London. One was married with 3 children, and the other one was a bachelor. And we were first 3 weeks with the one, and then the 3 weeks with the bachelor. And one thing the bachelor taught us, to dry dishes, the best thing to do is use newspaper. And so I learned how to use newspaper for drying dishes, although we don't do that today. And but there was a possibility for me to stay in England, but they would not give permission for my parents to stay at that point. And so I went back to Würzburg at that point. And in fact, in England, while I was in London, there was the Empire Games right after the Olympics in Berlin, and Jesse Owen I saw running his 100 meters and all the other people. And so that was that period. Then we tried to, as you know, to get to the United States, you had to have an affidavit of support. And there were 2 issues. That you needed the affidavit of support, and the quota for immigrants from Germany was 25,000 a year. And in no prior year, to 1938, did more than 25,000 apply. But in 25,000, more did. The State Department was really quite anti-Semitic in the United States, and they made no effort to increase that quota under the conditions that prevailed. So what they did is anybody who got this affidavit support after the 25,000 got higher numbers, and they were issued visas for coming later, the following year. So I was able to get my affidavit of support from the cousin. I think it was either the cousin or the, I'm not quite sure, the cousin of my mother's cousin, a somewhat distant relationship. And he lived in New York, and he was the director of the Wilson Meat Company, and he issued affidavits for quite a few people, but mostly younger ones, not my parents' age. And so I got this affidavit before. I went to Stuttgart, which was the consulate for America in my area, and you had to have an affidavit of support with you to go there, and you had to have a valid German passport. Well, I couldn't get a German valid passport. My father had made arrangements for me on the Cunard line to come to the United States. And the police said that maybe if he would switch to the Hamburg-America line, they might be helpful. And of course, that's what he had to do. And the Hamburg-America line representative took the passport to the consulate, kept it, and I only got it when we landed in New York. I mean, that was much later, of course. But so there are all kinds of things that were made more difficult. And then my...
Now, you said before you left, your family moved to Frankfurt.
that was in '37, yeah.
Can you tell me about that move and what was that?
Well, you know, as I said, we moved for two reasons. Number one, there was much more anti-Semitism in Würzburg than there was in Frankfurt. Frankfurt was much more cosmopolitan and also a very large Jewish community. And and the family had moved, part of the family had moved there, so we just followed. And we shared an apartment on the Unter Lindau with another lady. I don't remember exactly how that was, but and I got a job at Ehrenfeld, a company in the photo business in Frankfurt, and I learned photography and laboratory work and so on. And that, when I came to the United States, was the thing that I looked for initially as well. And if I jump to the, after arriving in New York in '38, I went down to the area of the Empire State Building because I had a name of somebody from Würzburg who worked for the Shanley Company, but he couldn't help me with anything. But I walked around and I saw a very nice photo store, but I didn't have quite the guts to go in. And that was on a Thursday or Friday. And I made up my mind, if I find the same store on Monday, I go in. And I walked in, and in halting German started to talk, and they answered me in German because they had come from Wiesbaden, also German refugees. And yes, you can work for us. And I got a job, and didn't ask how much they paid, but it was $7 a week for 40 or 44 hours probably, I can. And but this was in June, and on July 4th, I went to with my cousin to the Prospect Club. It was another German Jewish club in New York, and they had a big thing at the beach, and I met somebody who said that if I would join his company, I would get right away $12.95, and after 4 weeks I would join the union and I would get $17.95. Well, I thought I was a capitalist if I would do that. So after 2 weeks, I gave notice to the photo company and went to the other company. And what they did is they made leather elastic for shoes. And the only trouble was they often ran out of work. And since I was the low man on the totem pole, I would be laid off immediately. And until they had more work, and then they called me back. So it was not it sounded good, and it was better paid, but it was not continuous. And my uncle did some house-to-house selling of cough drops and a few other things. And when I didn't have to work, then I did the same thing. He gave me, an area to go, and I tried that. It was not very nice. I didn't care for that. And eventually, I joined another company, and that was a food company that imported sardines and other things from France. And there was also German Jews. And the only trouble, when war started, they couldn't import anymore. So that was the end of that. And then I ended up in another firm, again, by the German Jew. And it was a corset company. They made corsets. And I don't know exactly what I did. I know I didn't cut any. I must have just done some other work. And it was okay, but wasn't anything with a future. And eventually, my cousin who worked for the Butler company was promoted from the parcel post department to the export department, because the son of the owner who had done that work was called into the Army or Navy. So there was an opening for me, and I was interviewed by Mr. Loeb, the president, and he said, someday you'll be a good salesman. And so that was the story.
Sales experience. Pause. So we're going to keep circling back.
Okay.
I'm not quite ready to leave Germany yet.
Okay.
So you left Germany June of '38. Why don't you tell me about that period, starting in May with your father going to England, what it was like saying goodbye, your memories of the day you left.
Well, that was pretty tough. I mean, saying goodbye to first my mother as I went on the ship, that was very hard. And then meeting my father in Southampton. Yes, because we didn't know how soon we would see each other again, and didn't know at that point that it was going to be that many years before we be together. And actually, after that, I never lived with my parents because, as I said, I was already in the Army when they came, and then after the Army, by that time they had moved to Los Angeles, and I was living in San Francisco, and so I would visit them about every 6 weeks, but we never lived. I never lived with my parents after age 15.
Tell me again about your father leaving to England before you.
But my father, as I said, had gone to England regularly on business, and so he was there in 38. In 38 when the police wanted to talk to him, and through my uncle in Aachen, we let him know. We didn't want to do it directly because you never knew to what extent your phone lines were, in any way listened to. But we told him not to come back. So, it was a very, I'm sure it was a very difficult time, but you don't, when you're young, you're optimistic and you don't quite, I think it was probably even more difficult for my parents than it was for me, because I know I was going to join my cousin in New York, and when I arrived in New York, I had my first cousin and 3 second-degree cousins at the ship waiting for me, plus a representative of the person who gave me the affidavit, because that was important. But so coming back to more of Germany, I don't know what else you would like to know about that.
Well, tell me about your mother being arrested.
Oh, my mother, yes. Well, before my mother was able to leave, one night in October of '38, she was arrested by the police, and they claimed that she said that Hitler wants war. And whether she said that or whether that was just a reason for them to arrest her, I don't know. And but they let her go after one day. I think they wanted to steal whatever they could in our apartment, and then, but fortunately,
Did they?
huh?
Did they steal?
Did they do what?
Steal from the apartment?
Undoubtedly, yeah. I mean,
When you described
yeah. I don't know to what extent what they took. I don't know, but I have a feeling that was one of the reasons they wanted to see what they could find of value. And but I got the telegram from my father as I came home from Sim Restoro services in New York that my mother had arrived in England, which was a great relief for me. But
So you had said that your mother getting arrested made it easier for her to go to England?
no,
No?
that didn't make it. That didn't make it easier.
To get a permit? No? Made no difference?
Well, yes, my father had to get the permit for her, right? Yeah, I I don't quite remember the sequence of how that went. Yeah,
And when did your parents leave England for America?
in 1943, I think it was in June of. They had to come in a convoy. It took 3 weeks from England to New York, and. But as I said, that I was already in the army at the time, and my army service started in being inducted in Fort Dix, New Jersey, on a very cold January 1943, in a tent. It was not very pleasant, and then at first my first 6 months, maybe 3 months, down in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and then went to ASTP, Army Specialized Training at Johns Hopkins University in French language and area, since German I already knew. And from there I came to Camp Ritchie, Maryland.
Tell me all about your experience with Camp Ritchie.
But Camp Ritchie was a very interesting experience because we learned how to interrogate German prisoners, and it was a large group of German Jewish youth there, and in addition to others, obviously, so the experience was great for preparing us to interrogate German prisoners, and I left. Well, I was lucky there too, because the program, first of all, the program at ASTP was 9 months, but I was called out after 6 months to go to Camp Ritchie. And in Camp Ritchie, I was pretty lucky too that we were taken out before completion of a course, because they needed people faster, and because some of the people who later were called ended up in the infantry. So, but we were in teams of 6, and we were assigned different grades. I was initially a substitute, and the fellow who dropped out was a corporal, I think. So I started out as a corporal, and the first lieutenant was the head of a team of 6, and then master sergeant and another sergeant and so on. But as far as interrogating, we all did the same thing, except that 2 of us also had to drive a jeep, and I had a jeep, and we called that Doodlebug. And that was called Doodlebug because when we were lying at the pier in Southampton before embarking on Germany, before embarking, invasion. The German Sputniks were flying overhead, and we called them doodlebugs. And that's the name that my jeep got. So, but anyhow, it was the Army experience was very interesting.
I want you to describe to someone who has never heard of the Ritchie Boys, what are the Ritchie Boys? Why are they called the Ritchie Boys? And what were you trained to do, and your experiences?
Well, the Ritchie Boys is just simply a training to learn how the makeup of the German army, and so that you would know what to interrogate and what to find out, and the technique of learning how to interrogate. Because as a prisoner, the only thing you theoretically had to do is say your name, rank, and serial number. You were not required to do anything else. But of course, you were trying to get more information than that. And initially, of course, we may not have had as many prisoners.
Yeah, you're hitting the microphone with your
I'm
hand.
sorry.
Yeah. So who were the Ritchie Boys?
Starting again?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
You know, because say we wanted to have a part of our exhibit and then it was about the Ritchie Boys.
Yeah.
This is what I'm imagining. And we would need you to say the Ritchie Boys, you know, and these were Jewish emigres who spoke German. So to describe what the Ritchie
Well,
Boys were. Who were
the Ritchie Boys was really a group of different people, because it was a training for intelligence, but it encompassed speaking, and it also understanding other ways, maybe intercepting code or whatever. So there were different sections, but the main thing was to learn how to interrogate German prisoners, and a knowledge of German was essential. Some spoke better than others. I mean, in my team, there was one fellow from Brooklyn, and his German was not nearly as good as others. And but we we were just in the trained how to do that, and it was a very interesting group. But the AST group was also very good, so the two, in my mind now, after all these years, get a little bit intermingled. Yeah.
Who was chosen to be a Ritchie Boy or to go for this training?
Well, that was done, as I said, we were pulled out from the AST program, which was supposed to be a 9-month program. After 6 months, we took a test, as I recall. We went, I think at university in Raleigh. I think that's where it was, and we took some kind of a test, and on the basis of that, they selected us to go to Cambridge, and and obviously, because of the fact that the knowledge of German was important, many turned out to be Jewish refugees from Germany.
So now tell about going back to Europe as with the U.S. Army, from beginning to end. Tell me that story.
Well, I landed with my team on July 6th. The invasion had started June 6th, so 1 month later, and we were fortunate we didn't have to go through the water anymore. We could drive our Jeep directly on land, but we didn't have much territory. It was before a breakout in St. Cloud, and maybe 5 miles is all we had at that point. and then came the major, and we were assigned to Third Army headquarters. Yeah, 4 teams of us were assigned to Third Army, and we established a whole section with the teams, and then also I'm trying to think of the word, the ones that created the reports. Each of us reported what we found out, and then from there, a consolidated report was sent to G3. G2 being intelligence, G3 being operations. And so in the course of the many interviews we had, interrogations we had, obviously you found some who knew very little, and sometimes you found somebody who knew quite a bit and who was willing to pass on the information they had, because they were maybe not so much Nazis, and they wanted, some of them were formerly Social Democrats, etc. And so we got a lot of good information. One of the ones that I had was a sergeant by the name of Amtmann, and we always suspected, may have been helpful in preventing the bridge in Remagen to be blown up, which was a big thing, because that was the only bridge that existed over the Rhine. And it was mined to be detonated when the German army, when the American army came, but it was not done. It held up for 3 days. And by that time, we were able to create many pontoon bridges, and that was helpful. So, but this particular individual volunteered to give more information, and we called OSS, Office Strategic Services, and they took him away, and he worked with them after that. And as I say, we suspected that he may have been involved. We never got a confirmation. And I had many interesting experiences in interrogating others. Yeah.
Let's hear them. Tell me about them. About that. And you met General Patton. That would be good.
Well, yeah. Well, meeting General Patton is an exaggeration. He was standing next to me in a prisoner of war camp, and I don't recall that we had a great conversation.
Okay, so let's start with, so tell Henry, let's hear some of this your stories from interrogating and working with captured Germans as a Ritchie boy.
The experience of interrogating, was very interesting, and we were at the level of army, and at that level, you were not so much interested where is the gun that is shooting at me, but where do the provisions come from? Do you have enough weapons? Do you have enough supplies? And so on. So it depended at what point you were interrogating. And so being at that level, we were interested in finding out also political motives. What is the spirit? What is anything that is being done to subvert the German army or so? And we got, when you collected all that information together, it was quite a bit helpful to operations, because they could decide a little bit on that basis what they could do and could not do. I can't think of all the ones that I interrogated, but one was the valet of a former general, and not former, one of the of a general who was first on the Eastern Front and then went to the Western Front. I think it was named Kesselring or something like that. And so we got quite a bit of information from him. And then, but the main thing that I wanted to recall was the one who was then picked up by OSS because he was a social democrat and he was really very helpful, and he was a sergeant. What we found is that sergeants were often the best source of information. Officers were often more reluctant to talk.
Okay? All right, Henry, we were talking about, what were we talking about, Dave, when the battery went out?
We're talking about a giant buzz in my, my
Okay.
brain.
Huh?
You were talking about interrogation and
I think you were.
Well, let's just.
You were going to talk about the anti-Nazi.
Yeah, but let me just say that among the many interrogations I had was one of particular consequence because he was knowledgeable and he wanted to volunteer to help us. And so he was a sergeant, I can't remember which degree, but he was knowledgeable about the Remagen area because he came from that area. And the bridge at Remagen, and there's a movie on that, in fact, was mined to prevent American troops from going across. And however, it was not detonated. And we often suspected that this Sergeant Altman may have been responsible for delaying this. And after the 3 days, we didn't need it anymore, and it collapsed anyhow because of all the troops that had gone across. But that was pretty important. Later on, after the end of the war, I had some very interesting prisoners. One was Werner von Tippelskirch, and he had been in Moscow in the German legation. And at that point, our government became interested in finding out more about Russia. And so I spent a few weeks with him, and he wrote a huge article about everything, and I have a copy of it in my file, and that was taken, by the government, by the who was the it was made available to our government, yeah. And the other one was another nice group, was called the Bavarian Freedom Movement, and there was a Major Brown and a captain, and who were involved in that, and they had tried to, get rid of Hitler at one point, unsuccessfully, but so that was another big report that I have in my files. But this was after the war, when I was at Camp Freising, it was called. Freising was a town not far from Munich, and it was the Army intelligence headquarters after the war. And from there, in October of '45, I left for the United States.
Going back to when you arrived in Europe in 1944, were you nervous as a Jew to be going to near Nazi-occupied territory? What did that feel like?
In the Army, when I was in the Army? Mm-hmm. When I was in the Army, I don't think that I was, you had all the confidence. You never thought of that you could be killed. If you thought about that, you couldn't do anything. Yeah, you thought you were safe. Yeah, and fortunately, I wasn't exposed to any fire directly. At one time, pretty close because the camp we were was strafed, is the German word for it, by the German airplanes, and so I ended up in a foxhole together with a German prisoner. But outside of that, I was not under direct attack.
So were you ever nervous about getting captured?
Well, was I nervous about it? I really don't remember now whether I was nervous about it. Maybe I was confident in our army that we would prevail, you know. And of course, we had our ups and downs as well, because at one point, the Third Army had to come to the rescue of the First Army when they were encircled, and so, you know, it was not always easy, but we were confident. We had about we were probably in 20, 30 different locations. And at the end, there was, sometimes we even had, our group lived in a villa, and we had our own German cook. So that was not too bad. And so by and large, I don't think that I was worried about being captured.
What would have happened if you'd been captured?
If I had been captured, I don't know what would have happened. Yeah, I mean, that's why I had changed the name, but they still could have found out from my accent or whatever, you know. So I don't know. I might not be here to tell you. Yeah.
Did any of the prisoners who you interrogated, did they know you were Jewish?
I don't know whether they, I think it probably, I mean, they probably asked me sometimes, how come you speak such a good German, you know? And I may have told them, but I don't know that I made a big issue of being Jewish. I don't recall. Yeah. I mean, not a big issue to the German prisoners, yeah.
As a Jew, did you have feel any special motivation to go back and fight the Nazis?
Well, obviously, as a Jew, I felt very strongly about helping defeat Hitler. That you know, was no question about that, and so I don't think that many other thoughts really entered the mind. I mean, you know, how many millions went in the army? 10 million, whatever. So you just automatically did, and doing your part to help defeat Hitler. Yeah, that certainly was the objective. Yeah.
Did you ever have thoughts or feelings of revenge or?
Well, let me say about that we knew, of course, about the Dachau, which was the first concentration camp. But we really never knew how people were killed. We knew nothing about all the other. I didn't find out about the Holocaust until after the war. We never knew about that.
But you were in Germany until October 1945?
Yeah. But we never knew about people that transported to you know, Auschwitz and all those places. So, yeah, no.
Not until you returned.
If I often thought that if I had known how terrible things had become for Jews everywhere, I might have changed my mode of interrogation. I mean, the way I interrogated was, you know, the prisoner came in, I would sit him down, I would offer him a cigarette, relax him, because you don't get much information if you threaten. So, I mean, had I known how terrible the Nazis were behaving, I don't know whether I would have done it that way or not. You know, it's hard to know because we did not know the scope of annihilation of Jews in Europe. I mean, German Jews, probably half of German Jews probably were able to leave because it was over a period of time that it became. November 9th was a turning point. Up to that, things went gradually. But from that point on, they radically changed. So, and I wasn't there anymore. No, we didn't know. And the army made no effort to tell us, and President Roosevelt didn't tell us. You know, it was pretty much kept a secret.
How did it feel returning to Germany at the end of the war as a German Jew?
Well, when we were invited in 2012 by the city of Würzburg to come, I had no question that I wanted to go. And as Olga mentioned, she did not want to go, but our grandson Eric came with me, and it was a wonderful experience, really, to see, you know, how things had changed so much from the time we had left from this to this time in 2012. And there were a group of about 21 that came from all over Israel, South America, United States, Canada, and all people who had grown up in Würzburg, and a number of them who were left, you know, who had even been in camp, but not many. They mostly had left earlier. So, everybody had lost family. In my case, one of my grandmothers went to Theresienstadt. She lived she was taken from Frankfurt to the Theresienstadt Terrassen, the camp in Terrassen, and she died there. I think fairly soon after she got there. And that was the only one in my very immediate family who lost their life. And but so coming back, you know, we were welcomed with open arms, and everybody was assigned a particular family, and mine was Mr. and Mrs. Kreutzer, and as I said earlier, he was a professor at the university, and so they took us around, and a lot of things were planned, and dinners and presentations. So it was three good days. Yeah.
But of course, this wasn't your first time back in Germany since you left, because you were back with the army in 1945. So circling back, you're returning to a country that you fled from in 1945 for the first time.
Well, the army, I came in 1943. I mean, in 1944. 1944. We made one trip to Germany. Music of Remembrance also. Was that earlier? I can't, or afterwards, Ollie? After. Oh, no, that was afterwards. Okay. Yeah. But we had gone to Germany in connection with what we made a trip before to Germany. Trying to remember why we went. The same story that Olga had. But I can't remember what year that was. Anyhow, so we had just gone, among other places, to Würzburg, and I, of course, remembered everything there. And I think we must have taken a trip, a tour. We must have been on a tour, and that included Würzburg. I think that's what we did. Anyhow, I can't remember exactly. But I know that it's 2012 when I went back. Yeah.
So you went back twice
Went back
after, and then you were also back there with the army.
well, I wasn't back with, I mean,
You were in Germany with the army, yes?
well, Germany is a German, but the entire period of the war, I was in Germany. I mean, it was starting in Normandy and going from Normandy to Germany.
Well, you probably, the Americans didn't cross into Germany until about 19...
Pardon me?
After the Battle of the Bulge.
Yeah.
You know, so the American army reached, you know...
But the Battle of the Bulge was, which I alluded to before, was when the Third Army came to the help of the First Army, because remember the air, what was it? The 81st Airborne was surrounded by the Germans, and they was told that the Germans wanted them to surrender, and the famous words were something I can't. Well, anyhow, under no circumstances, so that's we changed direction because we were going in a different way before that. But no, we went. Our group went through all of Germany and ended up in Bavaria at the end. Yeah, but we had 20 different locations, or 20, 30 different locations in the course of the war. But we were always a little bit behind the front lines, which was okay with me. Yeah. And here we are.
And here you are. So you return home. So you return home after being in the army, and that's when you say you first heard about the horrors of the Holocaust. Do you recall when you recall hearing about that and your reaction, or?
But I don't recall now that it was immediately known. It took a while for it to become public knowledge. I mean, there was not much publicity about all of it at first. I don't remember at which point I actually knew more of the details. But but anyhow, I came back and went back to Brillo, and they knew that my parents had come and that my parents had moved to Los Angeles, and they offered me to go to California to be near them. And then the representative who handled California at that point lived in Los Angeles, and Sid Marcus was his name, and he said it makes more sense that if I would live in San Francisco. And that turned out to be a good thing, because I'm at the Jewish Community Center and other places. I found a young lady, and fortunately, we got married eventually.
Well,
After
I didn't get that story from Olga, so let's get it from you. Tell me about when you... Okay, so you're going to tell me about when you first met your wife.
When we first met, I often went to the Jewish Community Center, and also there was a youth group meeting at the Geary Street Synagogue, which was conservative. And one time I went, and obviously Ole had gone too, and she had left because obviously didn't find it too interesting and was outside. And I also went outside, and she was with somebody whom I knew, who had come from Würzburg, and introduced us. So Olga thinks that that is the first official meeting we had, but she also volunteered at the Jewish Community Center and passing out drinks and things like that. And I went there regularly, play ping pong, and listen to concerts and so on. So anyhow, but we had our first date on February 1st, 1947, and we got engaged on July 5th, and we got married on August 8th. And we celebrated our 70th anniversary a month ago. So that's been our happy life together. In San Francisco, I lived in a just a furnished room with another family that had come from Vienna, and of course, I had to eat out my meals out all the time, but it was just a normal thing. And every 6 weeks, I would be going to Los Angeles and stay with my parents for a week and visited customers in that area during that week. And later on, I wouldn't stay with them anymore. I would stay at the Ambassador Hotel, which was close by, and eventually we got married. And so what happened then was that I was offered a different territory because there I was an assistant, and I was offered Indiana and Kentucky, and Olga had lived in that area, and what I heard about it wasn't very enticing. And so I told Mr. Loeb that I always had heard young men go west, and I was already there. And number two, I have some connections now that I don't want to give up. And so gave up on that. And then it so happened that the man who represented Brillo in Seattle and for the Northwest was originally from Detroit. And the man in Detroit died, and he was offered to go back to Detroit, and I was offered to come to Seattle, to the Northwest. And but Seattle was the biggest city. Portland would have been another choice, but so we came to Seattle. At that time, the state of Washington had only had 2.5 million population, and Oregon 1.5. So it's grown a lot since then. But so we came here, and we stayed at the Mayflower Hotel for a number of weeks because we couldn't find any place to live. And then we finally saw an ad for in a room, what is it called? Room, not room and board, just a room near on Broadway and Madison, and they said yes, we could stay there, but we couldn't do any cooking, and so we had to eat out all our meals, which we did. And then we saw an ad. Then we saw a building going up near the university, and we thought that might be an opportunity, but that turned out to be the hospital, so that was not very helpful. And eventually we found a triplex on Whitman Avenue, 4111 Whitman Avenue, and we stayed there, and our son Ron was born there, and in '49 we moved to View Ridge area, and our first house, which we bought for $10,500. And we had $10,000 we could do, and we had a GI loan at 4%, and we needed $500 from Olga's parents to make the down payment. And we lived there until 1960, when we built our dream house on 56th Avenue. This was on 55th Avenue, on 56th Avenue, overlooking Lake Washington.
56th and where in 56th?
Above, between 70 and 73. Just where the, if you're familiar with the area, it's just where at the curve at 56th and 57th meet, and we were high up.
Well, that's great. We're lucky that the Seattle territory, the Northwest Territory for Brillo became available.
Yeah, and then
We
of
got
course,
you here.
yeah, and eventually, and I did this for 20 years. The Brillo company was sold to the Purex company in 1962, and for the 5 years, no changes were made, and then they did make changes, and I became an independent manufacturer's agent for the next 20 years, and did that. And Ron and eventually Steve joined us in the business, and Olga did some of the bookkeeping and paid wrote checks, and we did this until 2009. At that point, Steve, who had a PhD in literature, found a position with the University Medical School, and which he still is doing today. And Ron was able to join another rep company for a while. And for me, at age 79, it was time to retire. And
So let me ask you now some of the same questions I asked Olga. Why is it important to you that people, particularly young people, learn about the Holocaust?
well, because it is important for young people to know what can happen if hatred is enshrined as a policy, and people are selected to be persecuted. I mean, today the anti-Semitism exists today in the United States, no question about it, and even some of the things that are exposed when you listen to, like we did last night, the Southern Poverty Law Center showed all the things that are going on today against blacks, against Muslims, against Jews. So it exists today, and we have to be very watchful that people stand up against it and not let it develop into a serious situation.
And do you have any words or messages that you want to, anything else that you want to?
Well, we've been very active in the Seattle community. Olga was the first lady president of our congregation. I was a president prior to that. Then I was a president of the Northwest region of the union, and for 4 years. And so we've been active in the temple to this day. And for many years, I assigned the high holiday readers, and did that. And I was a member of the American Jewish Committee, and of course, Olga was active at the Jewish Family Service, and so we've been very much involved in many aspects of the Jewish community.
Indeed.
And the Holocaust Center.
That's an understatement.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, one last thing. Imagine your great-great-grandchildren, yet unborn, are going to be viewing this testimony. Is there anything you'd like to say, or any message you'd like to leave?
Well, the only message I can leave is to us, Judaism meant a lot. I hope it means something to them in the future. And it is a very inspirational thing in whichever way you may look at a God figure or nature or whatever it might be. But Judaism is involved with the community and a liberal view of life, and we hope you continue some of that.
A good message. Thank you, Henry.